I told my uncle that if he bought a haunted radio, then I would never speak to him again, and then he did it anyway. We were just eating Triscuits in silence, and I was stirring my tea when he told me this story. It was during the second week of March 1993. He was driving home from work late at night and he stopped for gas. The convenience store attached to the gas station was closed, but there was an old red-headed man behind the counter who looked to be about 80 years old. "Hello," said the old man. "Can I help you?" "Yeah," my uncle said. "Where can I find a good cheap radio? Something small with good reception." The old man nodded slowly and pointed over by the registers to a dusty Zenith transoceanic radio that had a bakelite case and looked to be about 70 years old. The radio was very cheap. My uncle paid for it and put it in his car. He drove home without turning on the radio. When he got inside, he placed it on the kitchen counter next to the telephone and the clock. That night, my uncle and my aunt went to bed and left the radio on the counter. They listened to the static between stations all night and they couldn't sleep. By morning, the radio was spitting out strange voices. At first it sounded like unintelligible gibberish, but then they began to pick out words. They turned the radio off and waited, but the voices continued. It sounded like the radio was emitting a low hum, and then the voices would come through clearly and say one word or two before being replaced by more static. The voices seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere. They could hear them from the other room and even outside in the backyard. When they went back into the kitchen, the voices seemed to be coming from inside the radio. They didn't know what to do, so they took the radio into my grandmother's basement and left it down there with the door open. Later that day, they went back down the stairs to check on the radio. Now the voices were coming from inside the basement. They sounded like they were moving around and getting closer. The voices in the radio continued throughout the entire house, and eventually they began to hear footsteps in the walls. They were slow and deliberate. They could hear them climbing up the stairs. My uncle and aunt ran out of the house and stayed away for several days. Then one evening they came back. They went downstairs to get the radio and bring it back upstairs, but it was gone. In its place was a pile of dust and a single sheet of paper. On the paper was written in pencil, "Thank you." And underneath that, April 2nd. They had brought the radio into the house on March, so they only had one day before whatever was inside the radio would come out. They tried to ignore it and pretend that it wasn't there, but the radio began to make its presence known throughout the house. Sometimes the voices would come from the radio, sometimes from the walls, and sometimes they would seem to be right next to them. They heard the footsteps again, and they followed them. They led them to the basement door. At first, the footsteps were slow and deliberate, then they picked up speed. It sounded like something heavy was dragging itself up the stairs. They watched the door at the top of the stairs, and when it opened, they saw a pair of size 13 work boots emerge. One of them had a holed toe. Then the rest of the apparition came into view. It was hunched forward and dragging itself up the stairs. It moved stiffly and it made a dragging sound like metal on stone. My uncle and aunt stood frozen with fear as the creature climbed out of the basement. It shuffled past them and then it stepped through the wall, leaving behind a gaping hole of light. The creature had no face. It was dark where it should have been. Then it spoke. Its voice was not the voice of the radio, but it was still distorted and inhuman. "Thank you," it said. "I am leaving now." And then it vanished. They never saw the creature again, but the footsteps persisted for weeks. One afternoon, my uncle and aunt went out into the backyard. The footprints were there in the soft earth. They were large and three-toed. They also seemed to be everywhere. They were on the driveway, on the porch, and even running along the side of the house. There were too many sets of footprints for any person to have made. It was as if whoever or whatever was inside the walls had crawled over every inch of their house. They called an exterminator, but he found no signs of a break-in. He looked in the walls and under the floors and even went into the attic. But he said that the only way to know for sure would be to tear apart the house and look. They didn't want to do that, so the house remained sealed. Over time, the footsteps became less frequent, but they never went away completely. Their new house had become a prison. They couldn't even leave the windows open in the summer. After 5 years, they sold it and moved away. But last year, my uncle accidentally ran into the new owner at the Piggly Wiggly. My uncle was immediately filled with dread because the new owner was walking around barefoot. My uncle knew that he had the same size 13 work boots that the creature had worn. And sure enough, the new owner slipped them on while he was shopping. My uncle said nothing, but he kept staring at the boots as the man walked away. Later, he admitted that he thought about confronting the guy and asking him what was inside the walls, but he decided against it. I asked him why he didn't destroy the radio. He said that he wanted to believe that the voices were coming from inside the radio and not from inside the house. If they came from the house, then it would mean that whatever was inside the radio would eventually find a way out. He believed that if they opened the radio, then it might be able to be stopped. But once the creature started moving around freely in the house, he knew that they were dealing with something that they couldn't fight. My uncle said that he will never buy another used radio again. As we talked, I noticed that the radio in our apartment was beginning to emit strange sounds. At first it was just static, but then I began to hear whispers. I didn't listen closely at first, but then I started to pick out words. "Open the radio," it said. "We want to come out." I immediately shut it off and threw it in the closet. Later that day, I emptied the closet to find some boxes, and I noticed that the radio had begun to melt, and the whispers were coming from inside the closet. Now, I keep the radio locked in a steel box in the basement, and sometimes I hear scratching from inside the metal. I don't know what's in the radio, but it wants to come out. I haven't seen it, but I hear it moving around sometimes. There's a spot in the floor in the living room that always seems to be cold. And sometimes I hear whispering coming from underneath the floorboards. And I know that if I start digging, then it will come out. I tried to tell my husband about it, but he thinks that I'm making it all up. But sometimes in the middle of the night, he will wake up and tell me that he heard something move in the closet. The other day, I was looking through the classified ads, and I think I found the radio that my uncle bought. It's on Craigslist, and the description says, "Antique radio needs work. Maybe I should go take a look." What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. And speaking of comments, here's one from a viewer. I love reading these. This one is from Tom Ward. Tom says, "I've had a recurring dream about someone trying to kill me by dropping a piano on me. For months, I have dreamed this about 3 or 4 times. Each time the same dream. Each time I wake up drenched in sweat. Now I hear a piano being tuned in the apartment above me. Is this some kind of message? I'm sorry, Tom. I'm afraid that your dreams might be coming true. Just kidding. I hope. Or maybe it's just your subconscious mind letting you know that you need to practice your piano scales. If that's the case, then I hope you make beautiful music, Tom. If you have a scary story that you'd like to share, then send it to the email below. And if I use it, then I will give you credit just like I gave credit to my uncle for inspiring this story. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.